We have dealt with Dr. King's declaration of what the problem was in Letter from a Birmingham Jail and the solution that he offered, which was basically the usage of natural law ethical reasoning. He invoked St. Augustine's claim that an unjust law is no law at all, and then spoke along those lines. So what we're going to look at is this idea that he set forward, the idea of natural law. That's what this video is focused on, but it's not going to be really looking at Dr. King himself, but at the issue that he raised. So natural law ethical reasoning has its locus classicus. The locus classicus of a thing is where it first appears in history, where we first see it. For instance, if you wanted to find the locus classicus of the word miniskirt, which was very popular when I was a little boy, miniskirts, you might have look and find that in 1963, September 12th, in the New York Times, is the first place that it was used. So we would call that the locus classicus, best as we know. I don't know when it started to be used. That's just an example. So this is the locus classicus in history, the classical location of the concept of natural law. This is a play written by Sophocles called the Antigone. And in the Antigone, it is about the city of Thebes and about a young woman who has lost, her name is Antigone, who has lost both of her brothers. The one brother, Eteocles, had become the king over Thebes, and he had another brother that he had not allowed to have any part in the government. And so that brother, Polynices, he attacked with a foreign army and came against the city of Thebes, and both men died in the battle that ensued. The man who steps into the arena and takes over the kingship when both of these young men are dead is Creon, and he has a rightful claim to the throne, and he's uncle to Antigone, so he's the uncle to the two dead men as well. And for one of them, for Polynices, because he brought these men from outside of Thebes and had them attack the city, and he was leading basically an insurrection against his brother, he will not allow him to be buried. He will not allow his body to be buried. He wants his body to lay and decay in the streets. Well, of course, that breaks his sister Antigone's heart, and she waits until it's dark, and she goes and gets the body of her brother, and she buries it. So when the body of Polynices is then missing from the public square, what King Creon does is he gets men with dogs, and they track down where the body is, and they dig it up and put it back where it was before. But now he sets a guard to see who comes, who's going to try to bury the body. And they catch his niece in the act of doing this, and they bring her before him. Now he is a king in the ancient world, so even though he's a blood relative, he's nonetheless somebody of whom she needs to be afraid. He has the power of life and death over her, and actually he eventually sentences her to death. So what happens here is Creon, who has decreed that her brother could not be buried, says to her, "Now tell me thou, not in many words, but briefly, knewest thou that an edict had forbidden this, that I had forbidden anybody burying your brother?" Antigone said, "I knew it. Could I help it? It was public." And Creon said, "And thou didst indeed dare to transgress that law? You dared to disobey me?" To which she says something that seems rather mocking, rather disrespectful of her uncle, even though he is the king. She says, "Yes, for it was not Zeus that had published me that edict. Zeus didn't command this." And then she says about his law that she doesn't think much of his law. Not such are the laws set among men by the justice who dwells with the gods below, nor deemed I that thy decrees, your decrees, were of such force that a mortal could override the unwritten and unfailing statutes of heaven. Her belief was that the right thing to do was to bury her brother. She thought that was a part of the natural law. There's a natural thing that we bury our dead. We don't allow them to have the humiliation after their death of having their bodies just rot in front of everybody. And then she speaks of those laws, and she says of those laws that she thinks are the decrees of heaven, "For their life is not of today or yesterday, but from all time, and no man knows when they were first put forth." So this is from the 5th century BC or BCE. This is from the time, right around the time of Socrates, a little bit before the time of Socrates, as far as we know, as when Sophocles wrote this. So Aristotle, who is Socrates' philosophical grandson, remember that Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle. Aristotle, who is Socrates' philosophical grandson, writes this. He says, by the two kinds of law of which he's speaking, he says, I mean particular law, what we would call positive law or case law, and universal law. Particular law is that which each community lays down and applies to its own members. This is partly written and partly unwritten. Universal law, on the other hand, he's saying, is the law of nature, for there really is, as everyone to some extent realizes, a natural justice and injustice that is binding on all men, meaning all people, even on those who have no association or covenant with each other. So we say that ignorance of the law is no excuse. We don't mean ignorance of the case law or the positive law. We mean ignorance when that statement is made originally. What is meant is the laws that everybody has to know. If you're coming into Athens, where Aristotle was, and you can only park your chariot on, this is a hypothetical, silly example, I'm just giving you an example. You can only park your chariot on the right side of the street on Tuesdays, and you park on the left side of the street because you're ignorant. Well, that's not what we mean by that ignorance of the law is no excuse. But we do mean that no matter where you're from, that you would know that murder is wrong in Athens. And so that you can't say, I didn't know that it was wrong to murder in Athens. It's okay back where I come from in Parthia. He goes on to say, it is this, that natural law, the law that's from above, that Sophocles' Antigone clearly means when she says that the burial of Polynices was a just act in spite of the prohibition made by her uncle Creon. She means that it was just or righteous by nature. And then he quotes right from the play, not of today or yesterday it is, but lives eternal, none can date its birth. So this is the first place in history, in Sophocles and then echoed in Aristotle, that we find this concept put forward. But it's probably not the first time in history that the concept was understood. It seems to be a universal understanding. So this is Seneca, the younger. He's a first century Roman Stoic philosopher. And he says this, he's carrying on this understanding. He's a different people. Remember that Aristotle is a Greek, this is a Roman. He says there is a true law, a right reason, meaning rational, conformable to nature, universal, unchangeable, eternal, whose commands urge us to duty and whose prohibitions restrain us from evil. Whether it enjoins or forbids, the good respect its injunctions and the wicked treat them with indifference. This law cannot be contradicted by any other law, and is not liable either to derogation, that means nobody's exempt from it, or to abrogation, it can't be repealed. So this is law that's lasting. He goes on to say, neither the Senate nor the people can give us any dispensation for not obeying this universal law of justice. It needs no other expositor, somebody to explain it, an interpreter, than our own conscience. It is not one thing at Rome and another at Athens, one thing today and another tomorrow, but in all times and nations this universal law must forever reign eternal and imperishable. That's a pretty, that gets it said. That explains what natural law is about. So this is me now speaking. From of old, from the ancient world, natural law reasoning in moral philosophy has had both secular and spiritual expressions. When Augustine echoes Plato, he is saying something from a religious standpoint that was said by a secular, secular as much as you can be in the ancient world, Athenian. And when Thomas Aquinas echoes Aristotle, the same kind of thing is going on. Augustine and Aquinas are religious men, and Aristotle and Plato are not particularly known for being religious. So both share this. The secular versions, the quote goes on to say, of this kind of thought are present in the pre-Socratics, the Athenian school, the Hellenistic philosophers, especially the Stoics, the legal philosophers of imperial Rome, and various modern philosophers since the 17th century. I'd say people like John Locke, for instance. Spiritual expressions of natural law are traceable to the ancient Hebrews and the early Christians, to the scholastics of the high medieval period, to Roman Catholic philosophers down to the present day. A lot of times if you say natural law, everybody thinks Roman Catholic, but it's not just Roman Catholic. And recently to numerous Protestant philosophers as well. Natural law is also arguably found in non-theistic Eastern forms of spirituality that espouse concepts like the Tao and Dharma. The Tao and Dharma are very much like unto natural law in what they're saying. In fact, recently, in 2012, this is kind of an irony to it, the atheist philosopher and neuroscientist Sam Harris has written a book claiming that science can provide us with what we need in order to do ethics. And he seems to be blithely unaware that he has used an atheistic form of natural law reasoning in order to make his case. So all of these different forms of natural law thought place the locus, the location of the law, in various spheres. But all of them hold that there is a law which is not a mere product of human decisions, cultures, or conventions. They all hold that it is discovered, it's not invented or created by humans, that we can discover and know right and wrong for real. So remember, in Dr. King's estimation, the biggest problem in his time was the failure of good people to stand up and oppose evil. And remember that his antidote to the sickness of segregation was to invoke the law above the law, or the natural law. Our Declaration of Independence, as I said in that video, is based on this form of reasoning. When we say in the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that's natural law reasoning, the idea of self-evident truth. So here's our friend Aristotle again. He speaks of per se nota knowledge, which means of itself obvious knowledge. He says, this does not constitute a proof of self-evidence. You can't prove that which is self-evident, is his point. It's axiomatic. Rather, it's a demonstration of its compelling nature. That which is per se nota, by definition, cannot be proven. One does not set out to prove the axiomatic, the basic, that which is a law that exists in all the world. Fascinatingly, this last quote, and this is the end of the video, is by Jeremy Bentham. And he says, for that which is used to prove everything else cannot itself be proven. The best-known legal philosopher of the 20th century, and the one who influenced the most famous legal philosophers and scholars of the latter half of the 20th century, was H.L.A. Hart, who taught at Oxford University. And the concept of law is his masterpiece. And in it, he says, although he's a positivist, he's a legal positivist, in it he says that if we didn't have the natural law, we'd have no foundation for any other law. And that behind and back of positive law is natural law. So Dr. King goes to the natural law to say we know right and wrong. And I want to say to you, do you know right and wrong?